interesting to it'd be interesting to really open it up and invite others to sit in on it as well, and to also include your feedback and your stories. So during this time, we really encourage you to participate in the chat. Let us know if something really resonates with you. Let us know if you have a question. We'll be saving some questions at the end for our panelists. So anytime anything pops up, please feel free to pop into the chat. We like an active chat. So please, please do that. And before I turn it over to Odelia and our panelists, I just want to quickly let you know who we are, like who's Navalia Collective and why we're doing this event. We like to say that we don't really do DEI, at least not the way that we have come to know it. We've noticed in working with our clients that people were really starting to burn out, starting to really feel like this work was exhausting them. And we really think that this defeats the purpose of the work, that in order to transform people, organizations, and systems, in order to make real change and real impact, this work needs to be nourishing and even joyful, especially during these challenging times. So at Navalia Collective, we take a really human-centered and relationships approach to this work, helping organizations get to the roots of their conflicts and challenges through storytelling, interactive workshops, and compassionate facilitation. And the reason why this workshop came about was because a lot of our clients are struggling with the idea of return to work and how to navigate those conversations. So with that, I'll pass it on to Odelia, who will introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Vina, and thank you again to our panelists for being here, and for you all for taking a break in your afternoon or maybe late evening for some of you on the East Coast to be with us. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and as Vina said, they represent a wide range of different industries, and then they'll share some experiences with some questions that we wrote, and then we'll open it up for you to ask questions afterwards. But if they say anything that sparks a really great question for you, you don't need to hold it in. Write it in the chat, and Vina's going to be monitoring the chat. We'll make sure to ask it later on in the end. So our panelists are Damen Scott, who is the Dean of School Culture at Achievement First Brooklyn High School. Timothy Daley, who's the head of biodata science at EpiCrispr, and Christine Pham, who's the deputy chief counsel at a government agency. And so I'd love for you all to just say your name again, where you work, and what your current return to work situation is. So what's going on with conversations where you currently are at about, are you in office, about to go back? What's that look like right now? And why don't we start with Christine?
Hey everyone, my name is Christine Pham, and I'm out here in San Jose, California. Really quickly, sorry, ideally I'm already forgetting the question, but our current situation is that we've been working from home. I'm at the NASA Ames Research Center. And just because I work for a federal agency, I always have to give the disclaimer that, everything that I say today is my personal opinion, and I'm here in my own personal capacity. But we've been working from home since March 8th, 2020. We have submitted, the agency work plan to, for approval in terms of the White House, but it's just a changing landscape. I think initially, like you mentioned, folks were thinking maybe potentially sometime in the fall, but with the new Delta variant, it's really hard to tell. So as of now, we don't have any immediate return to work yet. We are having, there are a limited number of folks that are considered mission critical or mission essential that are able to come, but by and large, for the most part, folks are still working from home. I'm in the legal department, and so we're definitely still working from home. Do you want me to popcorn it, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll popcorn to Damen.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Damen Scott, and I currently am the Dean of School Culture at Achievement First Brooklyn High School, which is in Brooklyn. And interestingly, our last day of work was March 12th, 2020 was our last day in person. And so when that happened, I was actually a teacher. And during that time, I've transitioned into leadership. And so we will be returning to full 100% in-person instruction in 2 weeks. So right now we're preparing the team about what that's going to look like. And as you can imagine, being in New York City, where it was pretty much the epicenter of really what was going on, at least at first, you can imagine just what the precautions are and just the different meetings we've been in and the meetings I'm in now. I just got out of one before I got on this, when it comes to safety stuff and how things are changing. So right now we are preparing to go back. But we also are having conversations around a hybrid situation, just in case, we are in an area where they're having spikes. And so in case we do have to close classrooms or the whole school, we do want to kind of proactively think about remote learning and situations where students and families may just need to use that as an option. So that's where we are kind of now in this whole conversation, which is funny, but yeah, that's where we are. But we are returning back in person, 100%.
And Tim?
Hi, I'm Timothy Daley. Situation has been a bit different because I work for a biotech company, which has been exempt this whole time. I came into the role last October. And from January on, I've been in person partially, and kind of taking a hybrid approach to this, because the people who do the lab experiments have to come in to do experiments, right? That's not something that can be done from home, right? You can't have like mice running around at home. Well, it's been tough. We had a COVID scare 2 weeks ago, and I told my team to work from home if they wanted to, and then also set the example by telling them I'm working from home. I would, it's your option too to work from home or not, but by setting the example, I think that's really leading them to, because if I would come in, they would feel obligated to come in, right? Or they might feel obligated. So yeah, it's really tough. And I got to say, I don't think this is going to go away for a little while. Indications seem to be that it's going to be endemic. And the colder weather coming up is going to make it worse. So I think people need to prepare. Even though death rates right now in the Bay Area are very, very low. The case rates have jumped up.
Yeah, it's definitely something that, people need to plan for and make sure that they have plans. And that's what we're talking about today. And thank you for, also adding about, when you're in leadership position, just modeling permission for people to do what they need to in these quickly shifting times. One of the things that we know from the past year in COVID is that COVID didn't suddenly make a lot of the challenges in our workplace and in our field. It really just highlighted a lot of the things that were always there and set a very sharp spotlight on them. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What are some of those challenges that were unearthed in your industry and your workplace in the past year? And let's start with Damen.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in education, one of the biggest challenges that I experienced was, and kind of going back to what you were saying around, I don't think this time really revealed anything new. I just think every time, you go through something really challenging, you really see the character of a people or a community or a system or whatever. And I think that we were in education in many industries at a time to make a decision, right? I think that we've known about educational inequities. We've known about educational disparities, particularly in communities of color and low income communities. And so I think we had an opportunity to make a decision to, I think about our work more equitably, right? And to think about how we can reach all students in all contexts all the time. And I think the challenge of that in being in education is that was not something that I think we did very well, right? Like, I think when it came to the conversations around just a lot of different things, politics and not politics, science and not science, like what's fact and not fact. I think all of that just played into building like a really serious just feeling of distrust in our communities. And I think that like trickled down into schools. And I think that trickled down into students and families. And so I think the challenge now is like, how do we rebuild that trust, right? Like, how do we still continue to create educational systems and institutions that empower all people? And I think, yeah, I think that's the challenge that we continue to answer in education, particularly in the, in the areas that I work.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Education has certainly, what you're saying about all those feelings about what's fact, what's not fact, what's like driving people apart, like all of that comes together in schools because schools are pillars of community and, can also be a place that's really trusted for hopefully to have like accurate and like compassionate information for how do we proceed forward. Christine, would love to hear about what challenges were unearthed for you in your sector.
Yeah, I think like one thing that, I was thinking about and reflecting on about this question, it's one thing that I think we really saw is that, prior to this, in a very kind of a high volume, high intensity industry, there's a lot of compartmentalization of, work life, home life. And I think this last year really forced us to, be mindful that, we all have distinct separate lives. For better or for worse, the pandemic really blurred those lines, right? Out of necessity from working from home. And, there was such a requirement to be really, really mindful of all of the differences, from a everything from societal differences to even like physical tangible things like where do we live. I mean, we're here in the Bay Area, right? There is a very kind of like a wide range of housing and shortages and where you live, and how do you actually take your home office and all of a sudden bring it to many different families and many different homes, and the family dynamics of the folks. It was just so many different things that I don't think we normally, I think we kind of take for granted prior to this, right? Like you don't really, you might have, the water cooler conversations with your coworkers about what's going on with their lives, but now you're seeing it, right? You're seeing their challenges, you're seeing the things that make them unique. So I think that was one big thing that really came to the forefront, because in making, any kind of efforts for teamwork, collaboration, and thinking through, how do we return to work? Like you have to consider all these pieces now, because you can't go really back to the way it used to be of, like work is work and home is home, right? I don't think that would be the best way to move forward. And so now it's understanding these differences and trying to make sure that we're intentional about incorporating it into our current, work from home environment, but also as you think about what the future holds when you return to work and how that looks like.
Absolutely. That blurring of personal life to work life is something we've all been adjusting to. And so, Tim, I'd love to hear how you're seeing any of that blurring in your work, as well as what are some of the challenges that have been unearthed in your industry and your workplace.
Well, I think, so my perspective is from like the tech perspective, right? The programming data science, it is a very, it's not like Damien's work of teaching, where it is that personal relationship, in that a lot of what I do can be done remotely. And I do see some there really embracing that and enforcing that. And like Vina said earlier, there is a contingency of people that don't want to go back in person. They really like this. But alternatively, on the other hand, I have seen people, particularly with younger children, who really want to go back, because it does create that boundary between work and home. And also in the current times, it like at the start of the pandemic, it was really difficult for childcare. And when the schools were closed, like what do people do? Which I always thought was really, I thought was relatively short-sighted of us, because we had shut down the schools for so long, which has hindered the social growth of our children. And then created all these difficulties for parents when children have never really been shown to be drivers of the viral spread. So I'm that is particularly concerning to me, and I really hope San Francisco figures out what they're going to do with their kids. I don't even have kids, but it does concern me for other people.
Yeah, it's become a very charged political conversation in San Francisco, I'm sure in New York and, wherever else other people are about, when schools reopen, but balancing making sure that people who work in schools are also safe, who also have families that they risk their lives for to come and teach kids. And also the ability right now, we've been talking a lot about breaking the status quo, and that's one of the status quo that we need to think of, is why for so long school has been a place of childcare for people, and why do we not have an actual childcare system that is very separate from what school hopefully is meant to be, and what that looks like. Before I jump into the next question, I'd be curious, Damen, if you had anything to add as someone who works in a school, what you think about this kind of tension of people who are like, I want my kids to return to school because, we can't do this all at home.
Yeah, I think that's like a big place of contention, right? Because I think being a teacher, it's definitely easier to do the job with kids in the building, right? It's very difficult to teach online, even though I think it's possible, but that's a whole nother skill set. And teaching in person and then training teachers to do it online is that, that's a whole separate thing about going virtual. So I definitely see the importance of being in the building. But yeah, at the same time, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, right? Something that like we just haven't seen in our lifetime, and something that people are really dying from. I know like I've personally had that happen to people in my family who didn't make it in this period. And so I think just thinking about that, I think, yes, we want kids to have a great learning environment, but at the end of the day, like we want kids and their families and our teachers and everybody to be alive and safe. And I think that in thinking about kind of what you're talking about, like we just need to rethink school, right? I think, and rethink what an education is. And I think even like I think empowering parents and families more, right? And equipping parents and families more too, to when we have situations like these where they're better equipped, I think, to pick up. Because I think, it's hard for a parent to know their child's academic identity, right? They're not in school with them all day long. But I think like schools need to build stronger partnerships, right, with families and communities in order when things like this happen. I think we can better like flex, right, and be a lot more malleable when we get in these situations, because I think safety is paramount. And so I think safety is paramount. I guess there's no way I think around that. Yeah, safety is paramount. And I think talking to my team, that's what we're talking about, is like how can we keep them safe as they come into the building, because I think that's the number one concern of the staff on my team, is like making sure that they're safe for their kids and their families when they go home. Yeah.
Absolutely. Christine, anything you'd like to add about families and your workplace?
I actually had my firstborn during the pandemic and returned to work.
Congrats.
Thank you. And returned to, from maternity leave in a situation where, like it wasn't safe still to get, to have her in daycare. And so she's much younger than I think, like the students, but it is that situation where like, even if I could put her in a daycare, I'm not sure that if that was the right choice, right? Because, it boils down to like each family has a, like all sorts of risk and considerations. And and the choices that they make to be able to stay in the workforce, right? To be able to keep their families safe. I mean, those are all considerations. And I really don't think it's like a one size fit all. And how do we do the best to enable to have these differences in personal circumstances so that we don't have to have, anybody feeling like, they're exposing themselves unnecessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like thinking about like everyone's got these different risk tolerance and things that they can or can't avoid. One of my closest friends, like her entire family, they live in a very heavily hit area of East Oakland. And, just like thinking about people who are more likely to be essential workers and going out there and just making sure that we're trying to stay safe for people who can't make the same decisions as everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, Timothy, thank you so much for bringing up families. And I'd love for you to kick us off in our next question, which is going to shift us a little bit to what have we learned? So, what are 1 to 2 things you've learned over the last year, specifically about how people work? And how is that driving how you show up in conversations where you're advocating for particular return to work plans?
I've learned everybody has different needs and everybody has a different situation, and I'm not sure if there's a one size fits all policy in this. I think you got to be flexible and understanding of their situation, and empathetic.
And how does that, like, what kind of things does that make you like advocate for specifically at your work? I know you already named one thing where as a manager, really kind of try and set the precedent to give people space to make choices that they might not, feel comfortable until they see you make those choices.
Yeah, just giving people the flexibility to work from home if they want to set their own hours as long as there's a significant overlap with the meetings with the scientists that we need to have. But yeah, just being flexible and understanding.
Yeah, so bringing a sense of that, just empathy. Like, I love that. Just being thinking about what other people are going through. How about you, Damen?
Yeah, very similar to Timothy. Thinking about, I think, yeah, people work very different, right? And I think now as a manager, thinking about how do I manage with people first, not necessarily product first leadership. And so thinking about 2 things, like how do I build that mindset within myself? And then how do I build that mindset within my team, right? As they go out into the school and work with other adults and teachers and students. And then 2, like, since I am doing a lot of coaching and giving a lot of feedback, that's a big part of my job. And that can always be an area of contention. I think it's around like 2, leveraging people's strengths and more so using their strengths and their natural like talents to get to the product rather than kind of using the product as the litmus for what we need. And so, yeah, I think that's like the biggest switch. If, teaching is very like data driven and very numbers driven, and it's easy to get lost in that and not necessarily see people. And so I think like leading with empathy and then thinking about how those can live in real systems, in my case, coaching systems, right? I think that's like the biggest thing that I'm thinking about as I go back to work.
Yeah, definitely. Has it made you make any like key switches to how you your relationship building with teachers?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I'm thinking one thing is really like just getting to know people first. And so what that can look like in my role is like, I can't get to know necessarily every teacher by having a one-on-one conversation, but more so like being in the building, doing a lot of observing. But when I'm observing, I'm not necessarily observing with a clinical eye. I'm more so observing with like a strength, like asset-based eye. and then connecting with teachers more so around their assets rather than like, and most teachers are, I think most people, when they get feedback, it's more so clinical and evaluative. And what we're trying to do is make it a lot more like, think about how you practice. Do you like it? Where do you see yourself going? How can I support you in that process? Rather than me saying, this is where I think you should go based off what we need. So I think that's the biggest switch.
Yeah, I love that. Just like, taking the lead from people sometimes. And Christine, what have you learned about how people work, and what's that driving you to advocate for?
Yeah, it's interesting because Timothy actually, I had written down some notes just to kind of, organize my thoughts, and my notes literally say, there's no one size fit all. I think one of the things that I learned about how our folks were, you really can't underestimate the ability of folks to rise in a situation like this, but at the same time, you really can't take it for granted either, right? I think, folks, I always kind of view my coworkers and, now as a manager, like, just seeing their amazing potential, and everybody really does want to do a great job. And so as a manager, one of your roles is really to protect that also, right? Knowing when to step in to protect your team from, whether or not, another organization is, pushing too hard, or whether or not you're reviewing, their work load and saying, hey, I know my folks will rise to the occasion and do it, but they've been asked to rise to the occasion over and over and over. And where do we draw the line? And what can we do as managers to draw that line and make that protective, kind of take that protective stance of our folks, so that they can, make sure that they have the time to replenish their reserves and replenish their, their energy, so that they can continue on without burning out. I think the other thing that I learned in terms of how folks works is that at first, it was really awkward for everybody to kind of have this insight into, like our lives at home, right? Like, one thing that I kind of, especially when I first came back to work, it was like always either off camera or blurring my background. I would honestly, like, have my baby bouncing in the bouncer next to me, and my husband and I would pass her between our meetings. But eventually I thought, it's important that, folks see how it is. Like, it can't be edited all the time, right? And so to the extent that, I could set that tone of, hey, I'm having my child here, or bouncing her in her, carrier while we're taking this meeting. It was important to me, at least, to set that tone of an unedited situation, so that folks know that, hey, you might be dealing with things, and you might feel like you're expected to come 100% as if we were at the work office, but that's not the case, right? Like, let's be honest, let's be real. We're juggling, our pets barking in the background, the baby's crying, or, just, solitude from being alone, when you might be a very social person that wants to be with your coworkers. And so that was something that I thought I could bring, which is just, hey, at least showing it as often as I could, so that, folks would feel comfortable with doing that too.
Absolutely. Two things I want to highlight that you said is, like, things can't be edited all the time. And so, something for everyone here to think about is, like, does your workplace invite a sense of, like, vulnerability? Can people be vulnerable and know that that's okay, and that that humanity is not going to be met with any kind of punishment, but it's going to be met with that empathy and openness? And also, what you said about, just because we can do it doesn't mean we need to do it or should do it. So in a time in which we need to really put, our social, emotional, and, like, mental health first, like, how are we balancing that workload with everything else that's going on? We've been over a year and a half now in a global pandemic, and that takes a toll on everyone's body, mentally, physically, emotionally, like, all of that's going on. And it's hitting certain people even harder, communities of color, vulnerable communities. And so how are we holding all of that? So thank you, Christine. And so our last question before I turn it over to some questions for people who joined us here tonight is, how are you having conversations with people at work about returning to work, when you'll return to work? And namely, I'd love to know who's invited to those conversations, and how are you making space for people to talk about what they might be looking forward to, what they're fearful of. So how are people able to engage, and what kind of things are you hearing? So why don't we start with Timothy?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about among the manager group, there's about 6 of us. We've been talking about, so the situation, for example, with masks, when cases started to rise in San Francisco, we instituted a mask policy before it was required again. Just because it's something just so easy, kind of low cost. Questions about whether to require vaccinations or not. What other questions? Questions about response to an outbreak. So we've recently had that. Basically, the protocol is contact tracing. First order contacts are tested. Second order contacts are not. But everyone's notified if there was another if there was a first order contact who tests positive, then we go through the process again. And so on and so forth. And yeah, there's not really any discussions about whether or not we're going to go fully remote or not because of the experiments need to be done. There might be questions about reducing capacity if cases continue to rise in the winter. But that'll be a discussion for the future.
Yeah, lots. There's always going to be discussion questions for the future, as you said. We're in this for a little bit. Christine, how about you? How are conversations looking, and how are people invited to join them, and what are they saying?
Yeah, so we have we're part of a fairly large organization. So I'd say that the efforts to gather feedback have occurred in different forums. I think in the largest forum, it's where, folks are having town halls and can give feedback, right? Obviously, there's pros and cons to it. The pros is that you have strength in numbers. So if other folks agree with, with what you're sharing, then it also, you have to kind of be that brave soul that will stand up to leadership and, be very candid about what you want. There are also anonymous feedback. So surveys, for example, I think the value there in an anonymous is that people can be candid, they can be frank. The downside of it, of course, is that you don't know who responds, right? Like, is it the same people that are always responding? Is it always the folks that, are not shy to voice their opinions? Or are you getting the folks that, normally might be a little more reluctant to share their thoughts, even if, in any settings, right? In our smaller office, like in our smaller direct office, we do one-on-ones with, like, for example, my boss has open office hours and he poses the questions in the group settings. But I do feel like even with that, you have to kind of consistently bring it up because, as we kind of all touch, like everyone's at very different parts about how they feel about what needs to happen next, right? Like, you might feel one way, in a situation, but like, for example, I'll just give me as an example. Like, on the one hand, it's been wonderful to be able to save all of the time in traffic and be at home and, be able to multitask when we're at home. But, the flip side is that it's really hard to concentrate with, young children at home. And so sometimes, like for me, the ability to go in the office is the ability to kind of protect my own time, my own boundary, like my identity as, as kind of separate and distinct. But at the same time, I don't know if I want to always have to be in the office, right? And so if you ask me at different stages, I might have a different answer for you. And so as we're formulating this, I think part of it is that we need to have, kind of all of these venues to provide feedback, whether it's a larger forum, whether it's anonymous, whether it's one-on-one, and consistently push that so that the folks that might not be sharing or might not feel like, they can share candidly, have different people. And sometimes that might include having your supervisors and the managers in that conversation. And other times it might be setting it up so that they can have candid conversations without supervisors and managers involved.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really resonates with me. Like, depends on when you ask me, like, where's the flexibility, as we're all learning new things about ourselves during this time as well. Damon, how about you?
Yeah, so I work for a charter network that's really kind of social justice oriented. And so they've done a really good job of like operationalizing this response. And so I would say that I have this conversation every day, multiple times a day, in multiple teams, both on the culture side, the academic side, and when we talk about special services for students. I think we're all having that conversation. And I think the big headline that I'm hearing that we're kind of talking about now is just diversity and inclusion, right? And how that looks in every level of our work, and not even from the student experience, but also from the adult experience, from the time they enter the door or log onto the computer to the time they shut it off or they leave a door, right? And thinking about what that experience is and how can we continue to refine it around this idea of equity. So yeah, luckily my organization is kind of, yeah, we're having those conversations. So I think that's one good thing I would say that came out of this experience for me professionally.
Yeah, no, it's really important to like, again, the pandemic just highlighted things that were always going on. So, it's like people who are feeling this, they were feeling many things before, and they're just really needing even more help now. So we had one question. I'm going to go to some questions in the chat. One big question is someone in the chat said, one of my biggest gripes about all of this is a question of it forcing people to return to in-person work, regardless of full-time or hybrid, the key point being forced days instead of being able to choose. Is that even equitable in the first place? So curious about anyone on the panel can answer.
Well, I think it depends on the type of role. For a like in my line of work, experimental scientists, yeah, they got to come in. They got to do the experiments. For a computational programmer, no, it's ridiculous. But there is a lot of grumbling that managers want people in the office because they want, either they want that control. In some cases, I think it's a way for them to justify their jobs. Because if people are working fine without their like close supervision, like what are they doing? Why are we paying this guy so much money to do this thing that doesn't need to be done? I hope there's a reevaluation of that.
Any other thoughts from the panel, or anyone, if you in the chat want to add anything to that as well? Another question was just kind of a more logistical one around, like, do any of your organizations or companies actually ask someone the distinction between if they need to come in or if their home situation is unsustainable to work at home? So do you actually ask that question, or do you just let people come in if they need to?
I've asked that for one of my employees really likes to come in, and I asked her, what's the situation? And she said, her house is just really kind of cramped. She lives with her mom and dad and grandparents. And she doesn't really have space for an office to work from home. And so, I asked her, what can we get you to make it comfortable? And so we ordered some things to improve her situation. I mean, I can't really improve the space situation, but extra monitors and whatnot. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, in our workplace, we don't have that much flexibility because we work in, we're in a school building. And so, our availability is really depending on the school district. And during this time, the building wasn't open. So people didn't have the option to come in. Everyone had to work from home. Now that we're opening back up, I mean, you do have the option to work in the building. But I think kind of going back to what Timothy said, yeah, I kind of think it depends. I think in education and in schools, there's just so many moving parts. It's just not as simple to say, oh, teachers can just stay home, right? Because you have kids who don't have homes to go to, right? They can, when they're at school, housing instability, all kind of stuff. And so I think it more so how I think about it is more so like beckoning the question, like, how are we like creating supports for families, teachers, like, everybody who's dealing with things that they may not need to be able to come into the building, right? And so one thing I'm thinking about, and I don't know if we're having this conversation, it's just a thought of mine, is like when it does come to remote learning, like what are options for students who spiked in remote learning, right? And how can we maybe make that a permanent option for some students and teachers, right? While still offering like in-person instruction. But yeah, I think that, and yeah, in education, it's not as flexible. So it's not as flexible. So I don't think people have as much free choice, I hate to say that, like to advocate for like their work environment. It's kind of like it's a lot of, I think, agreeing and disagreeing and consenting at the same time.
Yeah, I think my maybe not really directly responsive to the question, but I was thinking some thoughts about like equity and the kind of the basic question or answer is that, yeah, we do have the opportunity to kind of, if we do have capacity limits in terms of who can be on site, but there are opportunities to at least talk to your management line supervisors if there was a need, or you can't, somehow the home environment is insufficient for the work. There are a few things about remote work though that, I don't think it maybe is a byproduct, or maybe is an afterthought, or maybe is more like a silver lining of it. Like, for example, there are promotional opportunities where if you do, details, or, you do rotational activities, if that can be done remotely, that does open the door for, working families, like folks that can't just pick up and move to do a short stint, interns, for example, right? Like if they don't have to move to the very expensive Bay Areas, that might be an option. So those are the things that I think we do need to continue to explore, because, like even this conversation that we're having, right? We're having it with Damen and on the East Coast, and us on the West Coast, and the fact that we don't have to drive to San Francisco or Oakland, we're having that conversation, and that's a barrier to a lot of opportunities to participate on panels and so forth, right? So how do you keep that? How do you keep those good things that provide folks that might be constrained by family or other situations, and through like a remote environment? So that is one thing to consider. But the other side of it though is that, it's just thinking of all of like the service workers that were impacted by the fact that our centers closed, right? There are like food workers, janitorial workers, that really had it ecosystem from the fact that we were all there. And so how do we take those considerations into account, right? Because without having kind of a robust center or campus, the need for those types of positions might be lost. And so that's also something to consider, because we do live in this very expensive region that every job is very important. And so just a few thoughts on that too.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, for flagging that. And, something Timothy said just kind of sparked for me, the ability also for employers to make sure that people who are working from home still have the opportunity to make that work from home as comfortable as possible. And I know different workplaces have given gift cards and things like that. And one thing I, advocated for in one of the organizations we work with is to also like recheck again. We'd gone more than a year into the pandemic. It's like, you can't just like ask how could we help you once at the beginning of the pandemic and then never ask again. Like these things are constantly shifting, and we've been in this position for a long time. So one more quick question, and then I'll turn it over to Vina to send us out. If you could choose your ideal work schedule and location, what would you choose? And does that align with what your current organization or company offers? And I'll start with Damen.
That's a good question. No, my ideal work schedule would literally be the complete opposite of how I work now. I think that being at home for a year and a half, yeah, I like the autonomy. You know, I really did like the ability for me to do projects at my own pace. And I liked having my classes spaced out. I had never not been stressed before in my job as a teacher until I was in the pandemic. I had an opportunity to grade work. You know, I could give students real feedback. It was really interesting. And I think, yeah, if I could choose to do it again, I don't necessarily think I would teach remotely, but just thinking around just my own wellness and what made me happy, like that just really made me happy. And so, yeah, I liked having that autonomy during this time and away from the office. That would be ideal.
Christine?
So prior to this, we had a fairly flexible remote working policy already, and you know, fairly it's called like a max of flex schedule where you can, you know, conduct your work. And so, you know, I actually really I felt pretty happy with that. I think the one thing though that I'm really realizing is just how much time you save from not being in traffic. And so if there is one thing that I could do in the future, it would be, you know, how do I shrink or expand my work schedule so that I don't ever have to, you know, one, lose that time in traffic, but two, also contribute to, you know, the environmental issues that come with it, right? So it does line up, and that would be the one thing I would continue to change, is to completely avoid that and reclaim my time.
Yeah, definitely. There's some comments in the chat about some environmental things that we should think about too as we redesign the workplace. And Timothy?
I kind of like the changes because it allows me to, it's more acceptable for me to show up to work later and have a more flexible schedule. Like if I want to go, you know, surf or something. So I'm personally liking it. And I do like the what I feel is in the empowerment of the worker against management, even though I am a manager myself, but very recently. So, you know, my heart is still with the worker.
Yes, don't forget your roots. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is a definite power shift going on that I think will be beneficial for society in the long run, or I hope will be. But we'll see.
Well, thank you. I think that's a powerful and hopeful note to leave us on. I think there's a lot of changes that we'd love to see happen for workplace safety and health and wellness and empowerment. So let's just keep striving towards that. I'm going to turn it over to Vina to take us out. And thank you again, panelists, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all for your really honest conversations. I think it's sometimes really challenging to see big changes, especially in huge organizations that have a lot of barriers, like, you know, Christine, where you're working, but good to know that within your team, you all are trying to be flexible and trying to have one-on-one conversations with folks to meet their needs. And I also appreciate that feedback on, like, you always have to keep checking back. Like, I may think this works for me, you know, March through June, but maybe July and August looks different. So appreciate that note on just being really flexible for folks. And thank you to our audience for being here and for your questions, for your comments. We really appreciate your participation. If there's anything that comes up for you, any questions, any stories, anything you'd like to share, anything you'd like to discuss further as we build out this this article, this document, just to help people think about how to return to work, we'd love your insight. We'd love your feedback. We'd love your stories. We're just beginning to collect these stories now. And, you know, the more industries we work with, the more we realize how everyone has very similar issues that they're struggling with, but also very different issues as well, depending on the industry that you come from or the boundaries in which you need to operate. And I think today we got a really good, interesting glimpse of some of the confines of working in education, experimental science, government agencies, working in tech, things of that sort. So yeah, I just really want to thank everyone for being here. If you would like to reach out to us to just chat more, we'd love to hear from you. Please share with us your stories, share with us anything you'd like to talk about. This is where we can be reached, novaliacollective.com or contact@novalia.com. And once we have this article or white paper written, we'll definitely share it out to all our attendees, and would love to, get your feedback on that as well. So thank you all so much for being here, and we hope you have a good rest of your week and stay safe. I think at the beginning, Damen said safety is paramount. So we hope that you are able to operate in your teams to whatever levels make you feel the most safe, both physically, psychologically, and emotionally. As we know, all of those things are blurring together as we continue to navigate through this pandemic. People are using the language post-pandemic. It is not post-pandemic. It is still very real. And yeah, let's just continue the conversation and keep talking with one another. I'm hoping that, by sharing more and more ideas with one another, we can help instill and inspire better equitable practices that don't have to conform us to the status quo. So thank you all so much, and look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you, Vienna. Thank you, Adelia.
Yeah, it was
Thank
great.
y'all.